The unthinkable betrayal. The funeral home was filled with whispers and forced sympathy. Dark suits, pearl necklaces, and the clinking of crystal glasses as people murmured their condolences. Yet beneath the surface, there was no real sorrow, only speculation. Everyone wanted to know, who would inherit the Sinclair fortune? I stood at the front of the room, staring at my father's casket, his nameplate gleaming under the chandelier lights. Richard Sinclair, a visionary leader, a devoted father. The words felt like a cruel joke. The man in that casket had been many things: ruthless, powerful, and calculating. But devoted? No, at least not to me. For years I had worked by his side, studying every aspect of the Sinclair group. I had sacrificed relationships, personal dreams, and even my health to prove that I was worthy of his legacy. Everyone assumed I was the clear successor, the only one truly fit to run the company. But as I glanced across the room and locked eyes with Graham, my older half-brother, I felt a strange unease settle in my chest. Graham smirked. He looked far too relaxed for a man whose father had just passed. I should have seen it then. The real betrayal wouldn't come until later that evening, when the family lawyer summoned us to the Sinclair Group's headquarters for the reading of the will. The will that changed everything. I walked into the grand boardroom, where my father's most trusted advisors, along with key members of the company, had gathered. At the far end of the table sat Graham, his fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood, the picture of smug confidence. I took my seat, keeping my expression neutral. Ethan Carrington, my father's personal attorney, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "As you all know," he began, unfolding a thick document, "Richard Sinclair's final wishes have been legally documented and are binding." I straightened in my chair, waiting. Then Ethan's next words shattered everything I believed to be true. Richard Sinclair has left full ownership of the Sinclair Group, including all business assets, properties, and controlling shares, to his eldest son, Graham Sinclair. The words echoed in my ears. I must have misheard. It wasn't possible. I turned sharply toward Ethan. "What?" My voice came out too sharp, too raw. Ethan sighed. "The will is very clear, Miss Sinclair." I could barely breathe. I gripped the arms of my chair, feeling the world tilt under me. "This is a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. "Sorry, sis." Graham leaned forward, a devilish grin spreading across his face. "It's all mine now." I could hear people whispering around me, some sympathetic, others entertained. I turned back to Ethan, desperate. "My father trained me for this. He trusted me. I swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotion from creeping into my voice. "He wouldn't do this." Ethan hesitated for the briefest second. Something was wrong. But before I could push further, Graham reached into his pocket and tossed something onto the table. A key. A familiar gold key. It landed in front of me with a dull thud. "That's for you," Graham said, feigning generosity. "Dad didn't leave you the company, but he left you something." He nodded toward Ethan. "Go ahead, tell her." Ethan shuffled through the papers, then read aloud. "To my daughter, Lillian Sinclair, I leave the Sinclair estate in—" He stopped, looking uncomfortable. "A personal fund of $50,000. Laughter rippled through the room. $50,000? My hands curled into fists. Graham's grin widened. "I mean, it's something, right? You can maybe start a bakery or something." He waved a dismissive hand. "You always liked baking, didn't you?" Rage boiled inside me. This wasn't just an oversight. It was an attack, a deliberate move to erase me. I turned to Ethan, my voice dangerously low. "This is fraud. My father wouldn't do this." But Graham leaned back in his chair, looking far too amused. "Oh, Lillian," he said, shaking his head. "You're smart, but not smart enough. You never saw it, did you?" He leaned in closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "Dad didn't trust you. He never did." My blood turned to ice. "That's not true," I shot back. Graham only laughed. "Then why am I the one sitting in his chair?" I clenched my fists. I wanted to scream, to rip that smug expression off his face. But I didn't. Instead, I did something that surprised even myself. I smiled. Graham frowned slightly. He expected rage, begging, desperation. What he got was silence. Because he didn't know. He had no idea what I had done a week ago. The last move my father never saw coming. I stood up slowly, straightening my dress. "Congratulations, Graham," I said smoothly, keeping my expression unreadable. "You won." He blinked, clearly caught off guard. What?" I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Then I paused, turning back with a slow smirk. You really should have checked the board's bylaws before celebrating. His face darkened. What do you mean? I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen a few times before holding it up. An email. From the Sinclair Group Board of Directors. Subject, urgent. Final decision on CEO appointment. Graham's confidence faltered. He reached for the document, his eyes scanning the email, his face draining of color. What is this? He demanded. I smiled. While Dad may have left you ownership, he didn't leave you the right to run the company. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The board has to approve the next CEO, I continued. And guess what, Graham? I leaned in, lowering my voice so only he could hear. They picked me. For the first time, fear flashed in Graham's eyes. What? He whispered. I shrugged. Turns out they actually want someone who knows what they're doing. I took a step back and gestured to the room. Enjoy your title, big brother. I'll be the one actually running the empire. The room fell deathly silent. I turned on my heel and walked out. The battle was just beginning. The unraveling of power. Graham Sinclair had won the first round, but what he didn't realize was that the game had barely begun. I walked out of the boardroom with my head high, ignoring the questioning glances, the barely hidden smirks from those who had always bet against me. Let them think I was defeated. Let them underestimate me. That was exactly what I wanted. As I stepped into the elevator, I finally exhaled, my fingers tightening around my phone. The Sinclair Group was legally his, but controlling the empire? That was a different story. He had no idea that I had already secured the board's trust. He had no idea that the power he thought was his was about to be ripped from his hands. The doors slid shut, and I pressed a single contact on my phone. Mark, it's time. The fatal flaw. The next morning, I walked into the Sinclair Group headquarters, acting as if nothing had changed. But there was an energy in the air. Tension, uncertainty. Employees whispered as I passed, their eyes darting between me and the executive offices, where Graham had already begun moving in. It didn't matter. I walked straight to the boardroom, where the meeting of the year was about to take place. Inside, Graham was already seated at the head of the table, his feet propped up on the desk, looking far too pleased with himself. Nice of you to join us, Lillian, he said smoothly, sipping his coffee. Or should I say, former Sinclair heiress? I took a seat without responding, keeping my expression unreadable. Across the table, Thomas Langley, the chairman of the board, cleared his throat. We have an important matter to discuss regarding company leadership. Graham waved a dismissive hand. There's nothing to discuss. The will says it all. I own the Sinclair Group. That makes me CEO. Langley glanced at me, then back at Graham. Actually, Mr. Sinclair, that's not how it works. Graham frowned. What are you talking about? Langley folded his hands. As per company bylaws, ownership does not automatically grant executive control. The board votes on the next CEO, and your father, while naming you as the beneficiary, left the final decision to us. The color drained slightly from Graham's face. What? He scoffed, leaning forward. That can't be right. Oh, it is, I chimed in, sliding a document across the table. Page 47 of the company charter. Clause 23. You should really read before making assumptions. Graham snatched the document, his eyes darting across the words. His jaw clenched. But, he sputtered, Dad named me as the owner. He wanted me to run the company. Langley nodded. He left you ownership, yes, but he never explicitly stated that you should run Sinclair Group. His voice was calm but firm. We've been reviewing the situation carefully, and given your lack of corporate experience, financial knowledge, and leadership background, the board has decided. I watched as the tension in Graham's shoulders stiffened. And, he said through gritted teeth, Langley slid another paper across the table. The board has unanimously voted against you as CEO. Silence. A cold, sharp silence. I could hear the sound of Graham's world crumbling. I leaned forward, tilting my head, and whispered, I told you, Graham. You were celebrating a little too soon. The beginning of his fall. For the first time in his life, Graham Sinclair had no control. He shot up from his chair. This is ridiculous. I own the company. You can't do this. Langley sighed. We can, and we have. He turned to me. Effective immediately, Lillian Sinclair will assume all executive duties and act as interim CEO until further review. I smiled as Graham slammed his fists against the table. This is fraud, he roared. She manipulated all of you. I folded my hands on the table and raised an eyebrow. Or maybe, just maybe, Dad knew you weren't capable of running this empire. His face darkened. You'll regret this, he muttered under his breath. I leaned back in my chair, perfectly calm. Oh, I doubt that. He stormed out, but I knew this wasn't over. He wouldn't go down quietly. A plan in motion. After the meeting, I retreated to my new office, our father's office, the seat he had always reserved for his successor. The moment I sat down, the weight of victory settled over me. But I wasn't naive. Graham was dangerous when he was desperate. I picked up the phone and called Mark. He's going to retaliate, I said. Mark's voice was steady. We're already ahead of him. I smiled. Good. Now let's make sure he never gets the chance. Graham's next move. It didn't take long. By the next morning, the rumors started. Anonymous leaks, whispers of corruption and embezzlement within the company. Classic Graham. He was trying to paint me as unfit, as someone who had schemed her way into power. But he didn't know one thing. I had already prepared for this. That afternoon, I called for an emergency press conference. In front of cameras, reporters, and the entire company, I laid everything out. Graham Sinclair had been under investigation for financial misconduct. He had been stealing company funds for years, funneling money into personal accounts. And now, the forensic audit I had ordered weeks ago was complete. I presented the findings, cold, hard evidence of his fraud. The room erupted. And just like that, Graham Sinclair was finished. The endgame. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered, already knowing who it was. You ruined me. Graham's voice was hollow. I leaned back in my chair. No, Graham, you did that all by yourself. A long silence. Then a bitter laugh. I should have known. You were always waiting for this moment. I closed my eyes briefly. Once I had wanted us to be a team, but he had never seen me as his equal. Goodbye, Graham, I said softly. I hung up. He was out. And I was just getting started. Because while he had played for power, I had played for legacy. And in the end, I won. Title: The Power Shift. I arrived at my office early the next morning, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors of the Sinclair Group headquarters. The tension in the air was thicker than ever. Employees whispered in hushed tones, exchanging wary glances as I passed by. Everyone knew what had happened yesterday. Graham Sinclair had thought he secured his power, only to have it ripped from his grasp in front of the board. He had lost the CEO position. But that didn't mean he was done fighting. I pushed open the doors to my father's old office, now mine. The scent of leather and aged wood filled the air, but the space felt different. The last time I had been in here, my father had been sitting at his desk, reviewing company reports, giving me quiet nods of approval. And now, I was in his seat. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. I had won a battle, but the war wasn't over. The phone on my desk rang. I picked up. Yes? It's Mark, came my financial advisor's voice. You need to see something. He sent a file to my computer. I opened it, skimming through the numbers, and then I froze. My pulse quickened. Graham had started liquidating assets. Millions of company funds were being moved. A slow smile curved my lips. I knew he'd try this. I picked up the phone again. Contact legal. We need to act fast. Graham's last gamble down in the lower executive offices. Graham was desperate. I had taken the CEO title from him, but he still owned the company, and that meant he could cause damage before I had the chance to secure full control. He leaned back in his chair, fuming, his fingers tightening around the glass of whiskey he had poured for himself at 9 a.m. Across from him sat Paul Kensington, an old business associate known for shady financial moves. I need to move funds, quietly, Graham said, his voice tight. Paul adjusted his tie. That won't be easy now that Lillian is watching your every move. Graham scowled. I don't care what it takes, I just need enough to fight back. Paul hesitated. And what happens if this blows up in your face? Graham's grip on his glass tightened. It won't. She's just a glorified assistant who thinks she's in charge. Paul nodded slowly. All right, I'll make the transfers happen. But if you go down, you're on your own. Graham smirked. He thought he was still in control. He had no idea how wrong he was. The counterattack. By the time noon hit, I had already sent my legal team into action. The accounts were flagged. The transactions were halted. Graham's plan had been dead on arrival. I leaned back in my chair as Mark called me. It's done, he said. The money can't be moved. He's completely frozen. I smiled. And the board? They're watching, they know what he tried to do. I exhaled, letting the moment settle over me. Graham had spent his entire life thinking he was untouchable. He had never been held accountable, and now he was about to face the consequences. The confrontation. It didn't take long for Graham to come storming into my office. He slammed the door open, his face red with rage. You think you're smart, don't you? I leaned back in my chair, completely unfazed. Oh, I know I am. His hands clenched into fists. You had no right to block my accounts. I tilted my head. Actually, I had every right. You see, Graham, the moment you tried to steal from the company, you violated corporate policy. He scoffed. I wasn't stealing. I was protecting my assets. I slid a file across the desk. No, you were committing financial fraud, and the board knows it. Graham's eyes flickered with something close to fear. I continued, my voice steady. Right now, the board is deciding your fate. But if you ask me, it's already over for you. His jaw tightened. You think you've won? I gave him a slow smile. I don't think, Graham, I know. He stared at me, his breathing heavy. Then, without another word, he stormed out. The fall of a tyrant. The next morning, I received the confirmation. The board had voted to remove Graham entirely. He wasn't just stripped of power. He was being forced out of the company. I took a deep breath, allowing the victory to settle in. But it wasn't just about beating Graham. It was about restoring the Sinclair legacy. And I had just taken the most important step. Graham had always believed he was born to rule. But today, he was nothing more than a forgotten name in the company's history. And I was just getting started. The moment of truth. The boardroom was silent, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, fingers interlocked, scanning the faces of the executives who had served under my father for decades. Some looked hesitant, others unreadable. But I knew why we were here. Graham, my half-brother, sat across from me, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He had lost the CEO title, and now he was about to lose everything else. Langston, the chairman, cleared his throat. We have a critical decision to make today, he said, his voice even. The matter of company ownership must be settled. I could see Graham biting back his anger. He had spent years believing he was the rightful heir to Sinclair Corp. He had used his power recklessly, thinking he was untouchable. He wasn't. Before we proceed, I said, keeping my tone neutral, I'd like to present some new evidence. I turned to my assistant, Natalie, who slid a thick file onto the table. The executives leaned forward as I flipped it open. This, I said, is a full breakdown of Graham's financial misconduct over the past 3 years. The color drained from Graham's face. The final blow. I took my time flipping through the documents, letting the weight of them settle over the room. Let's start with this transaction, I said, pointing to a highlighted number. 1 week before my father passed, Graham attempted to move $10 million into a private offshore account. A murmur spread through the board. Some of them already suspected his corruption, but seeing it laid out in black and white, that was different. Graham scoffed, leaning back in his chair. You think you can manipulate everyone with your little papers, Lillian? I didn't blink. No, Graham, I don't think. I know. I turned to Langston. I've also requested a full forensic audit. As of yesterday, we've found that over $40 million were funneled through shell companies under Graham's authorization. Graham sat up straighter, his jaw clenched. This is a setup. Langston sighed, looking tired. Mr. Sinclair, are you saying these records are fabricated? Graham's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because we all knew the truth. I let the silence stretch, then pushed the final document toward him. This is a motion from the legal team. If the board votes to remove your ownership, we will also be pursuing charges. The room exploded into whispers. And Graham? He was finally afraid. The board's decision. Langston exhaled. I think we have all the information we need. Let's vote. Graham shot up from his chair, his voice a mix of panic and rage. You can't do this. Langston barely looked at him. Sit down, Mr. Sinclair. One by one, the board members raised their hands. Every single one. Unanimous. I watched as the realization hit Graham like a freight train. He wasn't just losing his position. He was being erased. The company that he believed was his birthright, gone. He slumped back into his chair, his breath uneven. I stood up, smoothing out my blazer. I believe that settles it. No one argued, because I had just won. Graham's last stand. I had expected Graham to lash out. I had expected him to try one last desperate move. And I was right. That night, as I was reviewing reports in my office, my phone buzzed. Natalie's voice came through, tense. "He's here." I glanced up as the door to my office swung open. There he was, Graham. His tie was loose, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man unraveling. "You think this is over?" His voice was low, dangerous. I leaned back in my chair, unfazed. "No, Graham, I know it is." He let out a bitter laugh, stepping closer. "You think you've won because you have the board on your side? Because you got them to vote me out?" I met his glare with a calm, steady gaze. "No, Graham. I've won because I earned this. Because you lost the right to lead this company a long time ago." He gritted his teeth. "You don't get it, do you? Without me, this company is nothing." I shook my head, standing up. "No. Without this company, you're nothing, and you just realized that." His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. I waited. He wouldn't attack. He was too much of a coward for that. Instead, he took a slow step back, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I gave him a small, knowing smile. "No, Graham, you will." Without another word, he stormed out, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. The new era. The next morning, I stood at the top floor of Sinclair Corp., looking out over the city. It was over. The corruption, the chaos, the years of my father's legacy being threatened. It was over. I turned as Langston entered my office, a contract in hand. "It's official," he said, placing it on my desk. "The final paperwork has been filed. You're the new majority owner." I picked up the pen, signing the document without hesitation. Because this company was mine now. I had spent years proving myself, fighting to protect the legacy my father built. And today, I wasn't just the CEO. I was the future of Sinclair Corp., and Graham? He was nothing more than a name in the past. A legacy restored. The city skyline stretched out before me, bathed in the golden glow of the early morning sun. From the top floor of Sinclair Corp., my company, I could see everything. Every building, every street, every piece of the empire I had fought to protect. And now, it was mine. For years, my father built this company with blood, sweat, and sacrifice. I wasn't about to let my brother destroy it. Graham thought he was untouchable, that his last name alone would secure his future. He was wrong. And now, with him officially gone, it was time for me to clean up the mess he left behind. I turned as my assistant, Natalie, walked in, her tablet in hand. "The financial reports you requested," she said, placing a folder on my desk. I flipped it open, scanning the numbers. The damage was worse than I thought. Graham had bled this company dry, wasting millions on unnecessary ventures, reckless investments, and personal luxuries disguised as business expenses. I exhaled slowly, shutting the folder. "It's time we undo the damage," I said. Natalie nodded. "What's the plan?" I looked out the window one last time before turning back to her. "We rebuild." The first order of business. By the time I stepped into the boardroom later that morning, every executive was already seated. The air was heavy with uncertainty. I had proven myself as the rightful leader, but now they were looking to me for something more. Direction. I took my seat at the head of the table. "Let's get straight to the point," I began, meeting their gazes. Under Graham's leadership, Sinclair Corp suffered. We lost millions. We lost investor confidence. We lost trust. No one argued. But today that ends. Effective immediately, we are cutting all wasteful spending. We will be focusing only on profitable, sustainable projects. Ones that align with our company's core vision. I glanced at my CFO. "Have you reviewed the contracts Graham signed in the last 6 months?" He nodded, looking grim. "There are at least a dozen questionable deals, and we're still uncovering more." I wasn't surprised. "Cancel anything that's not legally binding. If we're locked in, renegotiate. We're not funding anyone's vanity projects." Langston, the chairman, leaned forward. "And what about our investors?" The stock took a hit after the CEO transition. I had already anticipated this. "I'll be addressing them myself," I said. "A press conference is scheduled for tomorrow. They need to hear from me that Sinclair Corp is stronger than ever." A murmur of approval spread across the room. I could see it in their faces. They had spent years watching Graham mismanage this company, waiting for someone to restore order. And now, they had their leader, cutting the rot. The next few days were a whirlwind of action. I combed through every department, every expense, every unnecessary position Graham had created to cater to his friends. One by one, I shut them down. It wasn't about being ruthless, it was about saving this company. I personally called our top investors, reassuring them that their money was in safe hands. I met with department heads, realigned priorities, and made it clear that from now on, Sinclair Corp was a company built on results, not nepotism. And slowly, I started to see a shift. Employees who had been walking on eggshells for years breathed easier. Executives who had been forced to play along with Graham's reckless decisions started stepping up again. The culture of fear Graham created, I was tearing it down. A ghost from the past. I was in my office late one night, reviewing the final phase of our restructuring plan, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. I answered. Silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in weeks. Melissa, Graham. I leaned back in my chair, unimpressed. What do you want? A heavy sigh. I lost everything. I didn't bother holding back my laugh. No, Graham, you sold everything. Another silence. Then softer. I thought if I had the company it would prove something, that I was worth something. I shook my head. Dad never cared about titles, Graham, I said. He cared about character, and you never had any. A pause. Then a weak, defeated chuckle. I guess I finally understand. I closed my eyes, letting out a slow breath. I had spent years fighting for my place in this family, in this company, and Graham? He had spent his whole life throwing his away. I don't expect you to forgive me, he admitted. I opened my eyes, staring at the city lights outside my window. Good, I said simply. Another pause. Then, goodbye, Melissa. And just like that, he was gone. I set my phone down, exhaling slowly. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing approval. I wasn't waiting for my family to acknowledge my worth, because I already knew it. The new era begins. A week later, I stood in the main hall of Sinclair Corp, addressing hundreds of employees. This wasn't just a CEO speech, it was a new beginning. Sinclair Corp was built on hard work, I said, my voice steady, on vision, on a commitment to excellence. I met their gazes. For too long, this company has been weighed down by greed and entitlement. That ends today. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. I took a deep breath. We are no longer just a family business. We are an empire, and starting now, we rise together. The room erupted in applause. And in that moment, I knew. I hadn't just won. I had secured my father's legacy. Sinclair Corp was no longer about a spoiled heir's ambition. It was about the future, and I was leading it. A legacy secured. The sound of applause filled the air as I stepped off the stage. The energy in the room was electric, and for the first time in a long time, Sinclair Corp felt like a company with a future again. Employees were no longer walking on eggshells, executives weren't whispering in hushed tones about failing investments, and our investors, once uncertain, were now doubling down on their trust in us. We had turned the tide. And it was just the beginning. I walked through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging brief words of encouragement with team members. I could see it in their faces, the relief, the hope. This was their company too, and they finally had a leader who gave a damn. I stepped into the elevator, my assistant, Natalie, following close behind. Press conference in 30 minutes, she reminded me. I nodded. Let's give them something worth talking about. Facing the world. The cameras flashed the moment I stepped onto the stage. Journalists, analysts, and corporate watchers had been waiting for this, my first public statement as CEO. I took a deep breath and met their expectant gazes. Sinclair Corp has gone through a difficult transition, I began. For years, poor leadership decisions weakened the foundation of this company, but today I stand before you to say this: Sinclair is stronger than ever. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, cameras clicking rapidly. Our commitment to innovation, integrity, and excellence is unwavering. Over the past few weeks, we have eliminated wasteful spending, refocused our core initiatives, and most importantly, restored accountability. I paused, scanning the room. I know the concerns: investors worried about profitability, employees wondering about job security, and stakeholders questioning whether Sinclair can rise again. I leaned forward slightly. The answer is yes. Not only will we rise, but we will set new industry standards. The mistakes of the past will not define our future. The room erupted in a flurry of questions. Melissa, What do you say to those who doubted your leadership capabilities? I smiled. I let results speak for themselves. Another voice called out, and what about your brother? Any response to rumors that he may attempt legal action? The question was expected. I met the journalist's gaze. My brother made his choices, and so did the board. We are moving forward. I didn't need to say more. Because Sinclair Corp belonged to me now. The final closure. Later that evening, I was in my office, reviewing the latest financial reports. We were already seeing progress. I had expected this transition to take months, but the stock had stabilized faster than anticipated. Employees were engaged. The board was united behind me. There was just one thing left to address. A message sat unopened on my phone. Graham, he had sent it hours ago. I hesitated, then tapped the screen. Graham, I need to talk. Face to face. I exhaled slowly, staring at the text. Part of me wanted to ignore it. He had made his bed, he had burned every bridge. But something told me this was different. For the last time, I decided to hear him out. A brother's regret. I met him at a quiet bar downtown, far away from the corporate world that had defined both of our lives. He was already there when I arrived, slumped over a drink. The man in front of me was a shadow of the brother I had grown up with. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his usual arrogance was gone. I sat across from him, crossing my arms. Talk. Graham looked up at me, his eyes tired. I lost everything, he muttered. I tilted my head. No, you threw everything away. He let out a humorless chuckle. Yeah, I guess I did. For the first time there was no anger, no resentment, just acceptance. You were right, he admitted, about all of it. I thought being CEO would make me important, that if I had Dad's company, it would prove I was worth something. I watched him carefully. And now, he sighed, now I see that power isn't inherited, it's earned. I nodded slowly. Something you never understood. He took a long sip of his drink. And you did. I stayed silent. What happens now? He asked. I leaned back, watching him. That's up to you. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Relief? Fear? I couldn't tell. Do you think there's a future for me? He asked quietly. That was the real question, wasn't it? I thought about all the chances he had wasted, all the opportunities he had squandered. Then I thought about the look in his eyes now, the weight of genuine regret. I exhaled. I don't know, Graham, I said honestly. That's for you to figure out. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew the answer. We sat there in silence for a long moment, and for the first time, it didn't feel like war. The future of Sinclair. A week later, I stood in the Sinclair Corp headquarters, watching as our new strategies unfolded. Departments were thriving. Our investors had renewed confidence. The company was mine now, not as a birthright, but as a responsibility. My father built this company, but I would be the one to lead it into the future. I walked down the executive hall, pausing at the large glass doors that led to the CEO's office. My office. As I stepped inside, I felt something settle deep within me. For years I had been fighting for this moment, and now I had earned every bit of it. Sinclair Corp was no longer about family politics, entitlement, or old power struggles. It was about vision, leadership, legacy, and I was ready to build something that would last.